March 25th, 1420. The marshy plains near Sudomierz, southern Bohemia. 400 Hussite fighters, accompanied by women and children, had made camp between two large ponds, their 12 wagons arranged in a desperate defensive position. Pursuing them was a force of 2,000 mounted knights, the cream of Catholic nobility, confident in their numerical superiority and martial prowess. The knights sneered at the peasant militia before them. What they couldn't know was that they were about to witness a revolution in warfare that would render their entire way of fighting obsolete. Within hours, these armoured lords would be dead or fleeing in panic, and within 15 years, the tactics pioneered in this muddy field would defeat 5 international crusades and force the most powerful institution in Europe, the Catholic Church itself, to negotiate peace with heretics for the first time in history. This is the story of how Hussite war wagons stopped knights cold on open ground and changed medieval warfare forever. To understand how a force of mostly peasants could defeat the flower of European chivalry, we need to go back to 1415 and the execution of Jan Hus. Hus was a Czech priest and theologian who had become increasingly critical of the Catholic Church. He preached in Czech rather than Latin, making his sermons accessible to common people. He denounced the sale of indulgences, the moral corruption of the clergy, and the Church's vast worldly possessions. His ideas found fertile ground in Bohemia, a land already simmering with tensions between Czech speakers and the dominant German minority, between reformist sentiment and Catholic orthodoxy. When Hus travelled to the Council of Constance in 1415 under a promise of safe conduct from Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, he believed he would have a chance to defend his views. Instead, he was arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. The safe conduct that should have protected him was ignored. News of Hus's death sent shockwaves through Bohemia. The execution wasn't just seen as religious persecution, but as a betrayal, proof that the Catholic Church and its secular allies couldn't be trusted. Protests erupted across the kingdom. In July 1419, a Hussite procession led by the radical priest Jan Żelivski stormed Prague's new town hall and threw several Catholic councillors from the windows to their deaths. This first defenestration of Prague marked the beginning of open rebellion. When King Wenceslaus IV died shortly after, the situation exploded. His half-brother Sigismund claimed the Bohemian throne, but the Czechs remembered his role in Hus's execution. They refused to recognise him as king. The Hussites, now divided into several factions, began organising for war. The most radical group, known as the Taborites after their stronghold at Mount Tabor, formed a military religious community that rejected much of Catholic doctrine and hierarchy. More moderate Hussites, called Utraquists, wanted reform within the Church, particularly the right to receive communion in both bread and wine, not just the bread reserved for laity. Both groups united around the 4 Articles of Prague. These demands included free preaching of God's word, communion in both kinds, confiscation of the Church's temporal possessions, and public punishment of mortal sins. To the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire, these demands were unacceptable heresy. On March 1, 1420, Pope Martin V issued a papal bull declaring a crusade against the Hussites. For the first time since the Albigensian Crusade against the Cathars, the full machinery of holy war was being turned against Christians within Europe itself. But the Hussites faced a seemingly insurmountable problem. They were largely townspeople and peasants with minimal military training. They had few knights and little heavy cavalry, the dominant force in medieval warfare. Their opponents would field the best armoured cavalry in Europe. German, Hungarian, Austrian and Bohemian Catholic knights would come at them in wave after wave, each man encased in plate armour, wielding lance and sword, mounted on powerful war horses. Traditional military wisdom suggested the Hussites had no chance. A peasant infantry force couldn't hope to stand against mounted knights on open ground. Except the Hussites had something their enemies didn't. They had Jan Žižka. Born around 1360 in the village of Trochnov, Jan Žižka came from minor Czech nobility. Little is known of his early life, but by his teens he was involved in banditry and mercenary work. He served as chamberlain to Queen Sophia of Bavaria at the royal court in Prague. He fought as a mercenary for the Polish king at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, one of the largest battles of the medieval period, where Polish and Lithuanian forces crushed the Teutonic Knights. There, Žižka saw firsthand how organised infantry and artillery could break the charge of armoured cavalry. By the time the Hussite rebellion erupted, Žižka was approaching 60 years old. He had already lost one eye earlier in life, though whether by accident or in combat remains unknown. What he possessed was decades of military experience, an intimate understanding of how knights fought, and a tactical genius that would earn him a place among history's greatest commanders. When the Hussites needed a military leader, Žižka stepped forward, and he immediately recognized the central problem. His men couldn't match knights in a traditional battle. They lacked training, equipment, and cavalry. But Žižka understood something crucial. He didn't need to beat the knights at their own game. He needed to create an entirely new game where their advantages became liabilities. The solution came from the most mundane source imaginable: farm wagons. Every medieval army used wagons to transport supplies. They were essential for logistics but played no tactical role in battle. Žižka looked at these wagons and saw mobile fortifications. He envisioned chaining them together to create instant fortresses on any battlefield. Protected behind wagon walls, his inferior infantry could fight from defensive positions. Better yet, the wagons could mount the emerging technology of gunpowder weapons, firearms and artillery that were still finding their place in European warfare. The war wagon, or vozová hradba in Czech, Wagenburg in German, became the foundation of Hussite tactics. These weren't ordinary farm carts. Žižka developed specifications for purpose-built war wagons. Each wagon was reinforced with heavy wooden planks on the sides, sometimes backed with sheet metal. The walls featured firing slits through which soldiers could shoot crossbows, handguns, or small cannons while remaining protected. Some wagons had hinged shutters that could be closed for added protection, or opened for better visibility and firing angles. Heavy timbers reinforced the wagon beds to handle the recoil of artillery pieces. Each wagon was crewed by approximately 20 men. These included crossbowmen, handgunners, soldiers with pole weapons like pikes and halberds, and the most distinctively Hussite weapon of all, the flail. The flail deserves special mention because it embodied the Hussite revolution. In its military form, it was simply a modified agricultural threshing tool, a long wooden handle connected by a short chain or length of rope to a heavy wooden striker. Peasants had used these implements for generations to separate grain from chaff. The Hussites reinforced the strikers with iron bands and sometimes added spikes. In the hands of men who had used similar tools since childhood, the flail became devastatingly effective. Its flexible connection allowed it to swing around shields and over walls. The momentum of the heavy head could crush armour and break bones. Most importantly, it required no specialised training. A peasant who knew how to thresh grain could quickly learn to fight with a flail. For armoured knights who relied on their protection, facing an enemy wielding weapons specifically designed to crush metal was psychologically terrifying. Contemporary accounts describe knights panicking at the sight of flail-wielding Hussites. These simple agricultural implements became symbols of peasant resistance against aristocratic power. Back to that March day in 1420 at Sudomierz. The Hussite column had been retreating from Plzeň when scouts reported they were being pursued by a much larger Catholic force. The pursuing army included 300 Knights Hospitaller from Strakonice under Jindřich of Hradec, plus hundreds of other mounted men-at-arms under various nobles including Peter von Konopišť of Sternberg. The Hussites, led initially by Břenik of Švihov with Žižka as second in command, found themselves trapped between two large ponds. They had only 12 wagons, not enough to form a proper circular fortification. So Žižka improvised. He positioned the wagons to block the narrow causeway between the ponds, creating a fortified choke point. Behind this wagon wall he arranged his 400 fighters. The marshy ground around the ponds would hinder any flanking attempts by cavalry. When the Catholic forces arrived and saw the peasant army, they were confident of easy victory. They outnumbered the Hussites 5-1. They had the finest knights money could buy. The Hussites, recognizing their desperate position, actually raised a white flag and attempted to surrender. The Catholics refused. They wanted to crush this rebellion completely. It was a fatal mistake. The Knights Hospitaller, among the most prestigious military orders in Christendom, led the attack. 300 mounted knights charged straight at the wagon wall on the causeway. They expected to smash through or ride over these flimsy civilian vehicles. Instead, they rode into a storm of crossbow bolts and gunfire. The Hussites had positioned their firearms to cover the narrow approach. In the confined space of the causeway, the knights couldn't deploy their numbers effectively. They bunched together, making perfect targets. Horses screamed and fell. Knights in full plate armour crashed to the ground. Those who reached the wagons found them chained together and impossible to move, and then the flails came over the walls. The survivors of the initial charge tried to reorganize. Peter von Konopischt of Sternberg led another group attempting to flank the Hussite position by riding through the marshy area. The result was even worse. Horses and men became mired in the soft ground. Knights had to dismount to make any progress, immediately losing their primary advantage. Weighed down by 60 to 80 pounds of armour, they struggled through the mud, and that's when Žižka sent out his light infantry. The flailmen emerged from behind the wagons and moved among the dismounted, exhausted knights. The aristocrats, trained to fight on horseback or on firm ground in full armour, were helpless in the marsh. The agricultural tools rose and fell. Steel armour crumpled. Lords who had never known defeat on the battlefield were struck down by peasants wielding farming implements. The slaughter was methodical. Both commanders of the Catholic forces, Brzeniak of Świechow and Jindřich of Hradec, were killed in the fighting. As night and fog rolled in, the surviving Catholics withdrew in disorder. Under cover of darkness, Žižka led his Hussites away from the battlefield. Though casualties were heavy on both sides, the message was unmistakable. The peasant militia hadn't just survived. They had defeated one of the most formidable concentrations of knightly power in Central Europe. The Battle of Sudomierz established Žižka's reputation and proved the viability of the war wagon system. But it was only the beginning. 3 months later came the true test. In June 1420, Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund led the First Crusade against the Hussites. Chroniclers claimed he commanded between 100,000 and 200,000 men, though modern historians estimate the actual number was closer to 8,000 to 10,000. Still, it was a massive international force. Germans, Hungarians, Austrians and Catholic Bohemians marched under papal banners. Their target was Prague, the heart of the Hussite movement. Sigismund's army laid siege to the city in June. The Hussites, now including Taborite reinforcements under Žižka, fortified key positions around Prague. The most critical was Witkov Hill, which dominated the eastern approaches to the city. Žižka recognized that controlling this hill was essential. If the Crusaders took it, they could cut Prague off from the rest of Hussite Bohemia. He ordered the construction of wooden fortifications on the hill, protected by ditches and reinforced with clay and stone. According to legend, these fortifications were defended by only 26 men and 3 women, though modern historians believe the actual garrison was larger, perhaps 60 or more soldiers. The fortifications included 2 wooden blockhouses protected by a palisade wall. On July 14, 1420, the Crusader cavalry, primarily mounted knights from Meissen and Thuringia, under the command of Italian condottiere Pippo Spano, launched their assault on Witkov Hill. They rode up through the vineyards on the southern slope, confident their armour and training would overwhelm the handful of defenders. What happened next became legendary. The defenders, armed with crossbows, handguns and flails, held the fortifications against repeated charges. The narrow approaches up the hill prevented the knights from bringing their full numbers to bear. Horses couldn't navigate the steep, uneven terrain effectively. Knights who reached the fortifications found themselves facing defenders fighting from elevated positions behind wooden walls. The sound of gunfire, still relatively rare on European battlefields, added to the chaos. Then the Hussites in Prague, seeing the battle on the hill, launched a counterattack. They rushed out through the Podziska gate and hit the Crusaders from behind. Caught between defenders above and attackers below, on difficult terrain that neutralized their mounted advantage, the Crusader cavalry broke. They fled down the steep slopes and many died in the panicked retreat. The Battle of Witkov Hill was over in a few hours. Casualties on the Hussite side numbered around 30. The Crusaders lost an estimated 500 men. More importantly, they lost their will to fight. Seeing their elite cavalry routed by peasant defenders shattered Crusader morale. By November, Sigismund's forces had abandoned both Prague and Bohemia entirely. The success at Witkov made Žižka a national hero and terror to his enemies. But he continued refining his tactics. He drilled his men constantly, understanding that discipline was the key to making the wagon fortress work. He organized his forces into units, called rotas, each consisting of about 100 men manning 5 wagons. The wagons in each rota trained together, learning to deploy quickly and work as a coordinated unit. In battle, multiple rotas would form the wagon fort. The standard formation was a rectangle or square, with wagons arranged side by side, wheels interlocked, and the whole formation bound together with heavy iron chains. The chains were crucial. They prevented attackers from separating individual wagons and meant the entire fortress had to be breached to fail. Gaps between wagons were defended by men with polearms and flails. Artillery pieces, called houfanus, bombards, and smaller cannons nicknamed snakes because of their long, thin barrels, were positioned at corners and strategic points. The larger guns could fire stone or iron balls weighing several pounds. The handguns, called pistoly in Czech, were primitive by later standards, but terrifying to medieval soldiers who had never faced gunpowder weapons. A pistola consisted of a simple metal tube mounted on a wooden stock. The gunner would load powder and ball down the muzzle, aim the weapon through a firing slit, and ignite the powder with a slow-burning match. The weapons were inaccurate and slow to reload, but at close range they could penetrate armour, and the noise and smoke created psychological impact out of proportion to their actual effectiveness. The wagon fort wasn't purely defensive. Žižka developed offensive tactics as well. Once the enemy cavalry charges had been repulsed and the attackers were disorganised, sections of the wagon wall would open. Hussite cavalry positioned inside the formation would thunder out to pursue routing enemies. Hussite infantry would follow, armed with pikes, halberds, swords, and those ever-present flails. The combination proved devastatingly effective. The wagons protected the Hussites during the vulnerable defensive phase of the battle. Once the enemy was broken, Hussite forces could attack from a position of strength. This tactical flexibility was revolutionary. Medieval armies typically committed to either offensive or defensive postures. The Hussite system allowed for both in the same battle. In December 1421, Žižka faced perhaps his greatest challenge at the Battle of Kutná-Hora. Sigismund, still determined to claim the Bohemian throne, led a second crusade into Bohemia. He besieged Kutná-Hora, a strategically vital city that controlled important silver mines. The silver from these mines funded much of Bohemia's economy, so losing the city would be a major blow to the Hussite cause. Žižka, now blind in his remaining eye after a wound at the siege of Rabi, led his forces to relieve Kutná-Hora. Despite his total blindness, he continued commanding through trusted subordinates who relayed information about the battlefield. His army of approximately 12,000 Hussites faced a crusader force estimated at 30,000 Germans and Hungarians. On December 21st, the two armies clashed. The Crusaders launched repeated cavalry charges against the Hussite wagon fort. Each charge was repulsed with heavy losses. The Hussite guns and crossbows took a terrible toll. But Sigismund's forces had learned from previous defeats. Instead of exhausting themselves in frontal assaults, they attempted to surround the Hussite position. Catholic sympathisers within Kutná-Hora opened the city gates, allowing Crusader forces to enter. The Hussites found themselves trapped between the Crusader army outside and enemy forces in the city behind them. It seemed like certain defeat. That's when Žižka demonstrated the wagon fort's ultimate capability. Instead of remaining static, he reorganised his wagons into a column formation. Then, with all guns blazing, the entire wagon column charged straight at the weakest point in the Crusader lines. This mobile attack was something the Crusaders had never seen. The wagons weren't just defensive positions, they were offensive weapons, mobile artillery platforms that could punch through enemy lines. The column smashed a gap in Sigismund's forces. The Hussites poured through and escaped the encirclement. Sigismund, seeing the Hussites retreating, believed he had won. He didn't pursue aggressively, thinking the heretics were defeated. He was wrong. Over the following weeks, Žižka launched a series of raids and counterattacks. On January 8, 1422, at the Battle of Hebry, he caught Sigismund's rearguard and destroyed it, killing an estimated 12,000 Crusaders. The entire Second Crusade collapsed. The emperor barely escaped with his life. Sigismund withdrew from Bohemia, his army shattered. The blind general had achieved what seemed impossible. By 1423, Žižka had become so successful that internal Hussite politics turned against him. He left Tabor due to disputes with the town's leaders and formed his own faction in eastern Bohemia, called the Orobites or Orphans. The name Orphans came to apply to all of Žižka's followers after his death. In October 1424, while preparing for a campaign into Moravia, Žižka died, probably of plague. According to legend, he asked that his skin be made into a drumhead so he could continue to inspire his warriors even in death. Whether or not this actually happened, the legend speaks to his soldiers' devotion. After Žižka's death, his followers called themselves the Orphans, believing they had lost an irreplaceable father figure. But Žižka's legacy lived on in the tactics he had perfected and in new commanders who had learned under him. Prokop the Great, also called Prokop the Bald, assumed leadership of the main Hussite armies. Under Prokop, the Hussites not only defended Bohemia, but went on the offensive. Between 1426 and 1433, Hussite armies raided deep into neighbouring territories. They struck into Germany, Austria, Silesia and Poland. These raids, called Spanile Jízdy, or Beautiful Rides in Czech, brought back enormous plunder and spread terror across Central Europe. The Hussites burned towns, looted monasteries and demonstrated that they could project power far beyond Bohemia's borders. The Catholic response was to launch more crusades. After Sigismund's failures in 1420 and 1421 to 1422, there were 3 more major crusading efforts. In 1426 to 1427, a 4th crusade assembled, focusing on the Bavarian frontier. In October 1427, at the Battle of Tachov, Prokop's forces decisively defeated the Crusaders. The pattern was always the same. The crusading armies would assemble with great fanfare. Tens of thousands of soldiers would march into Bohemia under papal banners. They would encounter the Hussite wagon forts, and they would be destroyed. But the 5th and final crusade in 1431 deserves special attention because it encapsulates everything about Hussite warfare. In August 1431, Frederick V, Elector of Brandenburg, led a massive crusading army across the Bohemian border. He was accompanied by Cardinal Cesarini as papal legate. The Crusaders laid siege to the town of Damajlis on August 8th. 6 days later, on August 14th, Prokop's relief army arrived. According to some accounts, the Crusaders fled without fighting. They simply heard the Hussites singing their battle hymn, Ktoś su Boží bojovníci, which translates as Ye who are warriors of God, and saw the wagon columns approaching, and they broke. Whether from previous trauma, rumours of Hussite invincibility, or simple panic, one of the largest crusading armies ever assembled against the Hussites disintegrated without a proper battle. Cardinal Cesarini himself abandoned his ornate vestments in his haste to escape. The Hussites pursued into Bavaria, gathering plunder that chroniclers claimed was impossible to inventory. The Battle of Damajlis marked the end of crusading against the Hussites. The Catholic Church and Emperor Sigismund finally accepted that they couldn't defeat the heretics militarily. Negotiations began at the Council of Basel. Why were the Hussites so successful? The military explanation involves several interconnected factors. First, the wagon fort system negated the primary advantage of medieval cavalry. Knights were devastating when they could build momentum in a charge and use their lances and the weight of their horses to smash into infantry formations. But wagons chained together couldn't be broken by a charge. The momentum that made cavalry effective became a liability as horses and riders crashed into immobile wooden walls. The wagon walls protected Hussite soldiers from arrows and allowed them to use missile weapons effectively. A crossbowman or handgunner behind a wagon wall could take aimed shots without exposing himself to return fire. Second, the Hussites made extensive use of gunpowder weapons at a time when most armies still viewed them as novelties useful mainly for sieges. The Hussites integrated firearms into field battles as primary weapons, while individual guns were inaccurate, and slow to fire, concentrated fire from multiple weapons at close range was deadly. More importantly, the psychological impact of gunfire was immense. The noise, smoke, and devastating wounds caused by bullets created panic in enemies who had never faced such weapons. Third, the Hussite forces were more motivated than their opponents. For the Hussites, this was existential warfare. Defeat meant not just military loss, but death as heretics and the destruction of their entire way of life. They fought with religious fervour, believing God was on their side. The Crusaders, by contrast, were often mercenaries or feudal levies, fulfilling obligations to their lords. When faced with actual combat against an enemy that fought with fanatical determination and unfamiliar weapons, they frequently lost their nerve. Fourth, Žižka and his successors were brilliant tacticians who understood how to choose and use terrain. They positioned wagon forts on high ground where possible, used marshy areas to channel enemy cavalry into killing zones, and picked battlefields that favoured their defensive tactics. Fifth, the Hussite armies were surprisingly well disciplined for forces composed largely of peasants and townspeople. Žižka established strict military regulations, the famous Žižka's military ordinance, that governed everything from camp hygiene to distribution of plunder. Soldiers who violated the code faced severe punishment. This discipline, unusual in medieval armies, gave Hussite forces cohesion and effectiveness far beyond what their social composition would suggest. Finally, the wagon fort system was adaptable. It could be deployed quickly, configured in different shapes depending on terrain and tactical needs, and transitioned from defence to offence. This flexibility gave Hussite commanders options that their more rigid opponents lacked. But there were also political and social factors. The Hussite movement appealed to Czech nationalism and resentment of German dominance. It promised a more egalitarian society, where peasants and townspeople had voices. It challenged the Catholic Church's monopoly on religious authority. These weren't just soldiers fighting for territory, they were revolutionaries fighting for a new social order. The weakness of the Hussite movement ultimately came from internal divisions. The radicals and moderates within the movement wanted fundamentally different things. The Taborites envisioned a complete reorganization of society along more communistic lines. The Utraquists wanted reforms within the existing social structure. As long as they faced external threats, these factions could unite. Once the Crusades ended, internal conflict was inevitable. In 1434, at the Battle of Lipany, a combined force of moderate Utraquists and Catholics defeated the radical Taborites. Both Procop the Great and Procop the Lesser died in the battle. The radical phase of the Hussite movement ended. The moderate Utraquists negotiated the Prague compacts with the Council of Basel in 1436. These agreements allowed Bohemians to receive communion in both kinds and made other concessions to Hussite practice. In return, the Utraquists accepted Sigismund as King of Bohemia. The wars officially ended, though tensions continued for decades. The Hussite wars had profound and lasting impacts. Militarily, they demonstrated that properly organized and equipped infantry could defeat cavalry. This lesson was reinforced by later forces like the Swiss pikemen, but the Hussites showed it first. They proved that gunpowder weapons had a place on the battlefield, not just in sieges, and they pioneered combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, cavalry, and artillery into a single tactical system. These innovations influenced European warfare for generations. Religiously and politically, the Hussite Wars mark the first successful resistance to a crusade declared by the Catholic Church. An allegedly heretical movement had held its ground and forced the Church to negotiate. This precedent was not lost on later reformers. When Martin Luther challenged the Church a century later, the memory of the Hussites provided proof that resistance was possible. The Hussites were proto-Protestants, and many of their ideas were absorbed into later Protestant theology. Socially, the Hussite movement empowered peasants and townspeople in unprecedented ways. Men who should have been powerless according to the social order of the time became soldiers, leaders, and even generals. They proved they could defeat their social betters in battle. Though the most radical Hussite visions weren't realized, the movement demonstrated that the medieval social hierarchy wasn't immutable. For Bohemia specifically, the Hussite experience created a strong national identity centered on resistance to external authority and the Czech language. The phrase, "truth prevails," taken from Jan Hus, became central to Czech national consciousness and is today the official motto of the Czech Republic. The Hussite general Jan Žižka remains one of the greatest national heroes. A massive bronze statue of Žižka on horseback stands on Witkov Hill in Prague, overlooking the city he helped defend. It's one of the largest equestrian statues in the world, a testament to his enduring legacy. The war wagons themselves had life beyond the Hussite wars. Hungarian commander János Hunyadi, who observed Hussite tactics firsthand, adopted the wagon fort system for his campaigns against the Ottoman Turks in the 1440s. He used Czech and German mercenaries who knew the tactics and employed them effectively in several battles. The Ottomans themselves then adopted wagon fortress tactics, incorporating them into their own military system. The Wagenburg remained part of Central and Eastern European warfare well into the 16th century. Eventually, improvements in artillery made static defences like wagon forts less effective. Field guns became powerful enough to smash through wooden fortifications at range. The era of the war wagon as a dominant tactical system came to an end, but its moment in history was transformative. For about 15 years, from 1420 to 1434, peasant armies using modified farm wagons defeated the best cavalry in Europe. They stopped knights cold on open ground, something that wasn't supposed to be possible. They killed princes and scattered crusading armies. And they did it by turning defensive weakness into tactical strength, by making virtue of necessity, and by fighting with a determination that aristocratic armies couldn't match. The image of armoured knights charging across open fields has defined our vision of medieval warfare. But at Sudomierz, at Witkov Hill, at Kutna Hora, and at a dozen other battlefields across Bohemia, that vision met its match. Chained wagons manned by peasants with flails and primitive firearms created a new reality. The age of cavalry dominance was ending. The age of gunpowder and disciplined infantry was beginning. And in that transition, a blind Czech general and his army of commoners changed military history. When crusading armies heard the Hussite battle hymn echoing across Bohemian fields, when they saw those wagon fortresses taking shape, they knew they were facing something that couldn't be defeated by traditional means. Some armies tried anyway and were destroyed. Others broke and fled without fighting, their nerves shattered by tales of previous disasters. The result was the same. The Hussites, defending their land and their faith with improvised tactics and agricultural tools, had achieved what no medieval force was supposed to accomplish. They made open-field battle a death trap for cavalry. They forced the most powerful institutions in Europe to negotiate rather than dictate terms. They proved that the rigid hierarchies of medieval society could be challenged and overcome. The war wagons that made this possible weren't sophisticated weapons. They were farm vehicles, modified by necessity and deployed with brilliant tactical insight. But in the hands of disciplined soldiers fighting for survival and belief, they became instruments that reshaped warfare and history. That's the lesson of the Hussite Wars. Sometimes revolution comes not from advanced technology, but from reimagining how to use what you already have. Sometimes the weak become strong not by matching their enemy's strengths, but by creating new weaknesses to exploit. And sometimes peasants with farm equipment can defeat the finest knights in Christendom. The wagons have long since rotted away. The battles are centuries past, but the memory endures. In Czech national consciousness, in military history, in the story of religious reformation. The Hussites and their war wagons stopped knights cold on open ground, and in doing so they changed the world. The thunder of hooves and the screams of dying horses, the crack of handguns and the whistle of crossbow bolts, the methodical thud of flails crushing armour and bone. These were the sounds that haunted the nightmares of Catholic nobility throughout the 1420s. But to understand the full scope of what the Hussites accomplished, we need to examine specific battles in detail to see exactly how the war wagon system worked in practice and how it evolved to meet different tactical challenges. We need to understand the men who commanded these wagon forts and the soldiers who defended them, and we need to see how the psychological warfare waged by the Hussites was as important as the physical battles they fought. Let's return to the immediate aftermath of that first victory at Sudomierz in March 1420. Žižka didn't have time to celebrate. The crusade declared by Pope Martin V was mobilizing. By May, Sigismund had assembled his army in Hungary and was preparing to march into Bohemia. The moderate Utraquist nobles in Prague were wavering, some considering compromise with the emperor. The radical Taborites were being squeezed between Catholic forces and wavering allies. Žižka recognized that the Hussites needed to take the offensive, to prove they could win not just defensive battles but active campaigns. In late May 1420, he led his forces on a raid into southern Bohemia, targeting Catholic strongholds. At the town of Prachatice, Žižka demonstrated another aspect of war wagon tactics that would become crucial. His forces surrounded the town and positioned wagon forts at key points around the perimeter. But instead of immediately assaulting the walls, he brought up his artillery. The Hussite bombards, though primitive by later standards, were effective siege weapons. Each bombard was a massive cast iron or bronze tube mounted on a wooden carriage. Loading one required several men working in careful sequence. First, a measured charge of gunpowder was poured down the barrel. Then a wooden separator was inserted. Then the projectile, a stone or iron ball that could weigh anywhere from 10 to 50 pounds depending on the gun's caliber. Finally, more packing material was rammed down to hold everything in place. A gunner would then apply a burning slow match to the touch hole at the breech, igniting the powder charge. The explosion would hurl the projectile toward the target with tremendous force. Contemporary accounts describe the terror that artillery induced. Town walls that had stood for centuries, that had weathered sieges by conventional armies, crumbled under bombardment. The psychological effect was even more significant than the physical damage. The sound of artillery, a deep booming roar unlike any natural sound, carried for miles. Defenders never knew when the next shot would come or where it would strike. Some Hussite gunners became celebrities within the movement. Master gunner Jan Sokol, whose name meant falcon, was renowned for his accuracy. At the siege of Karlstein Castle in 1422, Sokol repeatedly hit specific sections of wall, widening breaches that made the fortress vulnerable. Though the siege ultimately failed due to the castle's incredible natural defences on a cliff top, Sokol's gunnery impressed even his enemies. The integration of artillery into the wagon fort system gave the Hussites capabilities that no other contemporary force possessed. They could defend on the march with their mobile fortresses, they could attack fortified positions with their siege guns, and they could rapidly transition between these modes. An army that besieged a town with the wagon fort protecting the siege works was nearly impossible to dislodge. Any relief force would have to attack the wagon fort itself, fighting the battle on Hussite terms. Back to the summer of 1420 and the defence of Prague. When Sigismund's massive crusading army approached the city in July, the Hussites had to defend multiple points simultaneously. Prague's geography made this complicated. The city sat on both banks of the Vltava River, connected by the famous Charles Bridge. Hills surrounded the city, and controlling these heights was essential. Witkov Hill to the northeast was the most critical, but there were other vulnerable points. Žižka couldn't be everywhere at once. He had to trust his subordinates and ensure they understood the tactical principles he had developed. This is where the discipline and training of Hussite forces became crucial. Each rota of wagons functioned as a semi-independent unit. The commanders of these rotas, men like Chval of Jepice, Divish Božek of Miletinek, and Jan Hvězda of Vicemilice, were seasoned fighters who understood Žižka's methods. They could make tactical decisions without waiting for orders from the supreme commander. This decentralized command structure was unusual for the medieval period, where armies typically relied on direct control by a supreme leader. The Hussite system allowed for flexibility and rapid response to changing battlefield conditions. At Witkov Hill, the initial garrison commander was possibly Jan Hvězda, though sources differ. What's certain is that the defenders knew exactly what they had to do. They occupied the hastily built fortifications and prepared to hold them no matter the cost. The attacking crusaders were primarily German knights from Saxony, Meissen, and Thuringia. These were professional warriors, men who had trained for combat since boyhood. They wore full plate armour, the most advanced protection available in the early 15th century. A complete suit of plate armour could weigh 60 to 80 pounds, but properly fitted armour distributed this weight across the body, allowing surprising mobility. The armour included a helmet with visor, a breastplate and backplate protecting the torso, pauldrons covering the shoulders, vambraces on the forearms, gauntlets on the hands, tassets protecting the upper thighs, greaves on the shins, and sabatons covering the feet. Every joint was protected by cunningly designed articulated plates that allowed movement while preventing weapons from reaching vulnerable flesh. Against opponents armed with swords, axes, or even arrows, this armour was highly effective, but against flails wielding crushing force, against crossbow bolts at close range, against primitive bullets that could deform on impact spreading their energy across a wider area, the armour was less reliable, and against the sheer determination of defenders fighting for their lives and their faith, all the armour in the world couldn't guarantee victory. The German knights rode up Witkov Hill expecting to sweep away the few defenders. They found instead a prepared position bristling with weapons. Crossbows fired from the wooden fortifications. The quarrels, short heavy bolts with iron heads, could penetrate armour at close range. Handguns added their staccato reports to the noise. The crude firearms were wildly inaccurate at any distance, but at ranges of 30 or 40 yards aimed at masses of attackers, they didn't need precision. The heavy lead balls, typically weighing about an ounce, could dent or pierce armour and always cause devastating injuries. Contemporary medical knowledge couldn't handle gunshot wounds effectively. The combination of trauma, lead poisoning and infection made even minor gunshot wounds frequently fatal. But it was in close combat that the Hussite weapons proved most effective. When knights reached the palisades and tried to climb or break through, they met defenders wielding various pole weapons: pikes, Long spears 16 feet or more in length kept attackers at a distance. Halberds, combining an axe blade with a spear point and often a hook on the back, could chop through armour or pull riders from horses. And then there were the flails. A knight climbing a palisade, both hands occupied with holding on, his head and shoulders exposed above the wall, was vulnerable to a flail strike from above. The flexible weapon could swing over the wall and come down on the attacker's helmet with crushing force. Helmets were designed to deflect or absorb strikes from swords and axes, weapons that cut or pierce. Against the blunt trauma of a heavy wooden head reinforced with iron bands, helmets offered less protection. The force transmitted through the helmet into the skull could cause concussions, fractures, or fatal brain injuries even if the helmet itself wasn't breached. The German knights were brave men fighting for what they believed was a righteous cause, the defense of Catholic Christianity against heresy. But courage wasn't enough. After repeated failed assaults, with dozens of knights dead or wounded, the attack stalled. Then the counter-attack from Prague broke what remained of Crusader morale. The psychological impact of this defeat echoed through the crusading army. They had brought overwhelming force against a handful of defenders and been repulsed with heavy losses. If this was what awaited them at every Hussite strongpoint, how could they possibly succeed? Within weeks, despite still outnumbering the Hussites significantly, Sigismund's army began to disintegrate. Soldiers deserted. Nobles quarrelled over strategy. The emperor, facing a deteriorating situation, withdrew his forces. The First Crusade had failed. The Hussites celebrated their victory, but they also learned from it. Žižka recognized that static defense of Prague wouldn't be enough. The Hussites needed to be able to maneuver, to carry the fight to their enemies, to threaten Catholic strongholds throughout Bohemia. This required perfecting the mobile wagon fort. Throughout late 1420 and 1421, Žižka drilled his forces constantly. He established training camps where new recruits learned the Hussite system. The training was comprehensive. Soldiers learned how to position wagons quickly, how to chain them together efficiently, where to place artillery for maximum effect, how to coordinate fire between crossbowmen and handgunners, and how to transition from defense to offense. Each man had to know not just his own role, but the roles of those around him. If the man next to you fell, you had to be able to take his place immediately. This was revolutionary. Medieval armies typically formed ad hoc, with little formal training. Noble cavalry trained individually from youth, but common infantry received minimal instruction. The Hussite system required that peasants and townspeople, men whose daily lives involved farming or crafts, become disciplined soldiers who could execute complex maneuvers under combat stress. The key to making this work was motivation. The Hussite soldiers weren't fighting for pay or feudal obligation. They were fighting for their lives, their families, their right to practice their religion as they understood it. Žižka reinforced this with constant preaching and singing. The Hussite battle hymn, Ktož sú Boží bojovníci, became more than a song. It was a statement of identity, a psychological weapon, and a tool for maintaining unit cohesion. When thousands of men sang it together while forming the wagon fort, it boosted morale among the Hussites while intimidating enemies who heard it. The lyrics were explicitly militant. Ye who are warriors of God and of his law, pray to God for help and have faith in him, that with him you will always be victorious. The hymn called on fighters to remember the fallen Jan Hus and to strike down enemies of truth. It promised divine favour to those who fought bravely and threatened divine punishment to those who wavered. Sung in Czech rather than Latin, it emphasised the national and linguistic dimensions of the conflict. When Sigismund returned with his second crusading army in late 1421, the Hussites were ready. The campaign that led to the Battle of Kutná Hora was a masterclass in Hussite operational art. Sigismund had learned from his previous failure. His new strategy was to avoid direct assaults on prepared Hussite positions. Instead, he would use his superior numbers to control territory, cutting off Hussite strongholds and starving them into submission. He besieged Kutná Hora, knowing its economic importance would force the Hussites to respond. Žižka marched to relieve the city with approximately 12,000 men. This was a smaller force than Sigismund's army, but Žižka wasn't planning a conventional battle. He would use mobility and the wagon fort's flexibility to avoid being trapped, while inflicting maximum casualties on the Crusaders. The initial engagement on December 21, 1421, followed the expected pattern. Crusader cavalry charged the Hussite wagon fort. They were repulsed with heavy losses. But then Sigismund tried something new. Instead of breaking off after the failed charges, he ordered his forces to maintain pressure while sending troops to occupy Kutna Hora. His plan was to trap the Hussites between his main army and forces in the city. For a conventional army, this would have been devastating. But the Hussite wagon fort wasn't a conventional fortification. It could move. Žižka ordered his wagons reformed into a column. Each rotor knew its position in the column. The reorganization happened with practiced efficiency. Artillery was secured. Infantry took positions alongside the wagons, ready to defend flanks. Light cavalry moved to the head of the column to scout and to the rear to screen against pursuit. Then the entire formation began to move. This was the wagon column, the Vozovar Hradba on the march, and it was one of the most remarkable military formations of the medieval period. Imagine a column of hundreds of wagons, each chained to its neighbours, stretching for miles. Between and around the wagons marched thousands of soldiers. The column bristled with weapons, guns pointed outward from wagon beds, pikes and halberds protruded from the spaces between wagons. Crossbowmen walked alongside, ready to form defensive positions at a moment's notice. The column moved slowly, perhaps 2 miles per hour at best, but it moved, and that mobility was what mattered. Crusader cavalry tried to attack the flanks of the column. They rode in, launched volleys of arrows or crossbow bolts, and tried to disengage before the Hussites could respond. But attacking a moving wagon fort was even more difficult than attacking a stationary one. The column's motion meant that attackers faced constantly changing angles and distances. Hussite crossbowmen and handgunners fired from the moving wagons, making coordinated cavalry charges difficult to sustain. If the Crusaders pressed too hard, sections of the column would stop and form proper defensive positions. The attackers would find themselves facing a wagon fort that had materialized in minutes. If they backed off, the column would resume its march. Žižka used this mobility to break through Sigismund's encirclement. He chose the weakest point in the Crusader lines, concentrated his column there, and smashed through with all guns firing. The Crusaders at that point, facing hundreds of wagons and thousands of determined soldiers, gave way. Once through the encirclement, Žižka didn't flee. He found defensible ground, formed his wagon fort properly, and dared Sigismund to attack. The emperor, having failed to trap and destroy the Hussite army, declared victory and began withdrawing. This was his second critical mistake. Žižka shadowed the withdrawing Crusader army. Over the following weeks he harried the Crusaders constantly. Whenever part of Sigismund's army separated from the main body, the Hussites attacked. When the Crusaders tried to forage for supplies, Hussite-like cavalry ambushed the foraging parties. When exhaustion forced the Crusaders to camp, Hussite guns bombarded them from a distance. The stress of constant harassment broke the crusading army's cohesion. Units began retreating on their own, rather than maintaining formation. Discipline collapsed, and that's when Žižka struck the decisive blow. At the Battle of Hebry on January 8, 1422, Žižka caught Sigismund's rearguard, approximately 12,000 men, separated from the main army. The rearguard, exhausted from weeks of marching and harassment, tried to form a defensive position, but they lacked wagons and proper fortifications. The Hussites surrounded them and formed wagon forts at multiple points, cutting off escape routes. Then the Hussite artillery opened fire. For hours the Crusaders endured bombardment. They tried to break out, launching desperate cavalry charges against the wagon walls. Each charge was repulsed. Hussite crossbowmen and handgunners fired methodically, choosing targets carefully, making every shot count. As night fell, the Crusader position had become untenable. Men were dying from wounds, cold, and hunger. No relief was coming. Some tried to surrender, others tried to flee. The Hussites showed little mercy. This was total war, and the Crusaders had come to exterminate heretics. The Hussite soldiers remembered burned villages and executed prisoners. They fought with the knowledge that capture by the Crusaders meant death by burning. At Hebry, the rearguard was effectively annihilated. Casualty estimates of 12,000 are probably exaggerated, but losses were certainly in the thousands. More importantly, Sigismund's entire Second Crusade collapsed. The emperor fled Bohemia, his army shattered. For the next several years, the Hussites faced no major crusading efforts. Instead, they went on the offensive. The Spanile Gisdi, the Beautiful Rides, were offensive raids deep into Catholic territory. These weren't simple plunder raids, though plunder was certainly taken. They were strategic operations designed to punish Hussite enemies, to gather resources for the movement, and to demonstrate that Bohemia's neighbours couldn't guarantee their own security. A typical Spanila Jizda involved several thousand Hussites, both Taborites and Orobites, with their wagon trains. They would march into Silesia, Bavaria, Austria, or Lusatia. The raiders moved quickly, covering surprising distances despite their wagons. When they approached a target, whether a monastery, a castle, or a town, they would deploy their wagon fort nearby and send out foraging parties protected by this mobile base. Towns that resisted were besieged with Hussite artillery. Those that surrendered quickly were treated relatively mercifully, being forced to pay tribute but generally spared destruction. Catholic religious institutions received no such mercy. Monasteries were sacked, their wealth confiscated, their buildings often burned. To the Hussites, these institutions represented everything wrong with the Catholic Church. The vast accumulated wealth of the monasteries was seen as stolen from the people who produced it. Hussite theology taught that the Church should be poor, humble, focused on spiritual rather than worldly matters. Destroying and looting monasteries wasn't just profitable, it was righteous. The psychological impact of these raids on Catholic Europe was immense. For generations, Christians had directed crusades outward, against Muslims in the Holy Land and Iberia, against pagans in the Baltic, against various heretical movements that were quickly suppressed. The idea that heretics could not only survive but raid deep into Catholic lands, that they could burn churches and loot monasteries with impunity, was profoundly disturbing. Contemporary chronicles are filled with descriptions of Hussite raids written in tones of horror and disbelief. One German chronicle described a Hussite raid into Franconia in 1430. They came like a plague of locusts, thousands of armed men with their war wagons. They burned churches and monasteries, killed priests and monks, and carried off everything of value. No army could stop them. When knights rode against them, they formed their wagon forts and destroyed the attackers with their terrible guns and flails. They sang their heretical hymns while our churches burned. It seemed the devil himself protected them. This was propaganda, certainly intended to motivate resistance and emphasize Hussite evil. But it also reflected genuine terror. The defensive capabilities of the wagon fort made Hussite raiding parties nearly impossible to stop. A conventional raiding force caught by superior numbers would be destroyed. A Hussite raiding party, when threatened, simply formed its wagon fort and became nearly invulnerable. The raiders could wait out pursuing forces, could fight from their fortifications if necessary, or could use the mobility of the wagon column to disengage and continue their raid elsewhere. This was asymmetric warfare centuries before the term was invented. The Hussites couldn't match Catholic Europe in total military resources. They were outnumbered, outfinanced, and lacked the institutional support that Catholic rulers could draw on. But they had developed a tactical system that negated many of these disadvantages, and they had the will to use that system ruthlessly. In 1426, Prokop the Great, who had emerged as the primary Hussite military leader, led a massive raid deep into Germany. The Hussite army, estimated at between 10 and 25,000 men with hundreds of war wagons, marched through Saxony and into Franconia. The raid covered hundreds of miles over several months. German princes assembled armies to stop the raiders. At the Battle of Osse in June 1426, one such German army, approximately 24,000 men including heavy cavalry and Meissen infantry, tried to intercept the Hussites. Prokop formed his wagon fort on high ground overlooking the Elbe River. The Germans attacked repeatedly throughout the day. Every assault was repulsed. As evening approached, Prokop launched a counterattack. His cavalry and infantry poured out of gaps in the wagon wall and fell on the exhausted German army. The result was a rout. Thousands of Germans died, many drowning in the Elbe as they tried to flee across the river. The Hussite victory at Aussig demoralized German resistance for years. The raid continued, with the Hussites eventually returning to Bohemia laden with plunder. Prokop had proven that Hussite armies could operate offensively deep in enemy territory, with the same effectiveness they showed defending Bohemia. The Fourth Crusade in 1427 fared no better. Cardinal Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, helped finance this crusade, bringing English troops to fight alongside Germans and Hungarians. The crusading army assembled in massive numbers, perhaps 50,000 or more, and marched into Bohemia from multiple directions. At Tachov in October 1427, they encountered Prokop's army. The pattern repeated. Crusader cavalry charged the wagon fort. Artillery and missile fire repulsed them. The Crusaders, rather than persist, withdrew. The Fourth Crusade ended almost before it began, another humiliating failure. By 1430, Pope Martin V was desperate. He issued bulls promising full remission of sins to anyone who fought the Hussites, equivalent to the spiritual rewards of fighting in the Holy Land. He promised that property taken from Hussites was legitimate plunder, not subject to normal prohibitions on theft. He granted crusade preachers extraordinary powers to recruit and finance armies. The response was the Fifth Crusade of 1431, the largest yet. German princes, Hungarian nobles, Polish knights, and even some English and French volunteers assembled under Cardinal Cesarini. The army that marched into Bohemia in August 1431 may have numbered 70,000 or more. Chroniclers claimed 150,000, certainly an exaggeration, but even conservative estimates put this force at significantly larger than previous crusades. Cesarini was confident. With such overwhelming numbers, surely the Hussites could be crushed. The crusading army laid siege to Domajlis. Prokop, commanding the Hussite relief force, marched to break the siege. On August 14th, the Hussites approached Domajlis. According to multiple sources, as the crusading army heard the Hussites singing Ktojcu Božibojovníci and saw the war wagons appearing on the horizon, panic spread through their ranks. Soldiers began fleeing. Officers tried to maintain order but couldn't. The entire crusading army dissolved into a terrified mob running westward. Cardinal Cesarini fled so hastily that he abandoned his cardinal's regalia. The Hussites pursued, slaughtering hundreds of crusaders and capturing enormous quantities of supplies and equipment. The Battle of Domajlis, or rather the non-battle, was the psychological culmination of Hussite military dominance. The largest crusading army ever assembled against them had run away without fighting. The Hussite reputation for invincibility, earned through years of victories, had become a weapon in itself. After Domajlis, the Catholic Church accepted that military solutions had failed. The Council of Basel opened negotiations with the Hussites, something unprecedented. For the first time, the Church negotiated with heretics as equals. The resulting Prague Compacts of 1433 granted significant concessions to moderate Hussites. But this diplomatic success ironically led to Hussite military defeat. With the external crusade threat removed, internal divisions within the Hussite movement could no longer be contained. The moderate Utraquists, now negotiating with the Church and Emperor, saw the radical Taborites as obstacles to peace. The Taborites, in turn, viewed the moderates as traitors to the revolution. In 1434, these factions went to war against each other. The Battle of Lipany on May 30th, 1434, saw Hussite fighting Hussite with the tactics both sides knew intimately. The Utraquists allied with Catholic forces commanded by Divish Božek of Miletinek, formerly one of Žižka's commanders. The radicals under Prokop the Great employed their standard wagon fort tactics, but their opponents knew these tactics just as well. The battle was savage, with both sides using war wagons, artillery, and the full repertoire of Hussite weapons. Prokop the Lesser, and many other radical leaders died fighting. The radical Hussite movement was effectively destroyed at Lipany. The moderate Utraquists and Catholics could now impose their vision of peace. In 1436, Sigismund was finally recognized as King of Bohemia. The Hussite wars officially ended, though isolated resistance continued for years. The war wagons didn't disappear immediately. Hungarian forces under János Hunyadi adopted the tactics in the 1440s, using them effectively against Ottoman armies. At the Battle of Yalomitsa in 1442, Hunyadi employed a wagon fort to defeat a larger Ottoman force. He hired Czech mercenaries who knew the system and trained Hungarian soldiers in the tactics. The Ottomans, facing enemies who fought from behind wagons, found their cavalry charges frustrated just as European knights had been. They responded by developing their own version of the wagon fort called taburchengi in Turkish, which they used in various battles throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. The legacy of Hussite tactics extended far beyond Bohemia. The proof that disciplined infantry using gunpowder weapons and field fortifications could defeat cavalry influenced military thinking across Europe. The Swiss pikemen who dominated battlefields later in the 15th century learned from Hussite examples. The Spanish tercio formations of the 16th century combining pikes and firearms descended from similar principles. The integration of artillery into field armies, which would eventually dominate warfare, was pioneered by the Hussites. But perhaps more important than specific tactical innovations was the broader lesson. The Hussite wars demonstrated that technological and tactical innovation could overcome apparent material disadvantages. They showed that motivated troops with effective leadership could defeat forces that were larger and better equipped by traditional measures. They proved that defensive positions, properly used, could be turned into offensive weapons, and they revealed that psychological warfare, the deliberate cultivation of a terrifying reputation, could be as effective as physical combat. The Hussite war wagons stopped knights cold on open ground by making the ground itself a weapon, by turning mobility into protection, and protection into a launching point for attack. They ended the era when heavily armoured cavalry could dominate battlefields simply through shock charges. They ushered in the age of gunpowder and gave common soldiers the means to fight as equals against their social superiors. When you stand on Witkov Hill today, looking out over Prague, you can still feel the weight of history. The massive statue of Jan Žižka on his warhorse dominates the hilltop, his face turned toward the city he helped defend. The blind general, rendered in bronze with all the fierce determination that made him unbeatable, stands watch over the nation his followers helped create, and if you listen carefully, perhaps you can still hear the echo of that battle hymn, the song that struck terror into the hearts of crusading armies and gave courage to peasants who stood behind wooden wagons and changed the world.